Today, we become legends.
So Smite's first warrior in a while has dropped into Tilted Towers, aka my ranked games, and has been throwing his own children at the minion wave for his own benefit for far too long. It's time we took him down a peg with a copium rant video where I explained that Surtr is broken and I'm not just bad at solo lane. Let's jump in, boys. So the first thing that anyone notices about Certa is the way he decimates minions faster than you can say nerf tanks. This guy's lane pressure is hands down the best in the entire game at the moment, and that's after several nerfs to both his direct pressure and his sustain, which indirectly adds to his pressure since he can take more trades, poke you out and heal back up. Release Surtr was a complete joke with how insane his passive was with no stack limit. No idea how they thought that would be a good idea at any point, to be honest. Release Surtr could literally infinite tank a tower. I didn't even know before this release that towers had a scaling limit to their shots. I always assumed it went up forever, but no, Surtr exposed that they actually do have a cap, and he could reach it and still be at full health due to his passive at release having infinite stacks. So thank god that was nerfed quickly and put a cap on it, but his passive is still really insane and one of the best warrior passes in the game in my opinion. Hercules has a similar thing going on with his 3 in that he takes damage and heals a percentage of that back, and this has been nerfed so many times over the years, from 130% of the damage at max rank all the way down to just 75% now. Almost a 50% decrease. Oh, and back in the day, this also used to scale with his missing health, so at half health it healed an extra 25% and 50% at minimum health. Sure, this ability has gotten protections and attack speed added, but the core component, the healing based on damage taken, has been completely destroyed by nerfs over the years. But back to Surtr, since this isn't a Hercules rant, the whole reason I went on that tangent is to show why heroes should know they have to be careful with healing based on damage taken effects. And doubly so when it's a passive that is always active with no cooldown. You have to take 15% health to get a fragment that heals 3%, so at minimum this is straight up removing 20% of all damage you take. People complain about mitigations for a reason, and if you think about this guy, he basically has 20% free mitigations at all times from this passive. Albeit anti-healable, yet most of the brainlets in my ranked games that actually let this guy through don't ever buy anti-heal against him anyway. But that 3% for 15% number is the most optimistic way to put it. As I mentioned, this passive stacks up, thankfully not infinitely like it did at release, but still 3 times. And so if you can keep yourself at the max of 3 stacks by picking up more fragments, this actually heals 9% per fragment, since it refreshes the duration and stack count each time. Granted, it's hard to be taking so much damage that you are permanently at the stack cap, but it definitely happens, especially in late game teamfights or when tanking towers or objectives. When considered this way, he actually gets 60% mitigations for free. Of course, heavy air quotes on that mitigations thing, it's not actually mitigations, but it's the easiest way to show how strong this passive really is and how long Certa can live in fights. Plus, it's very relevant to the current meta. That's not all this passive does though, it also gives protections per stack, some base and some per level, which when there was no cap was just completely silly, and with a cap it's more so an added benefit, but especially early on this does more work than you think. Even a few protections in the early game can be huge, and this gives up to 21 protections at level 1. Certa himself only has 28 physical and 35 magical procs at level 1, so this is well over half his base procs added on, and makes him much more tanky in those first few waves. Not only reducing the damage you deal to him, but massively reducing minion damage too, so he pretty much doesn't care about aggroing minions in the early levels. And boy does he benefit from aggroing minions. He has one of the strongest swing chains in the game for a warrior, having 2 high damage cleave hits in the middle and a final swing that hits harder than Will Smith at the Oscars. Aggroing minions allows him to really maximize those middle hits and cleave the wave insanely fast, especially early on, when you only have 1 or 2 abilities available. Those cleave basics clear the wave as if he had an extra ability to hit it with early on, and it starts his disgusting pressure game from level 1. For a comparison to another oppressive cleave warrior, Osiris has a very similar hit chain, except his cleaves are 0.51, whereas Certa's are 0.751. And closer to the start of his swing chain, so they come out a bit faster as well and work better with cancelling the chain through an ability. These autos are another less noticeable reason why Certa absolutely dominates any solo lane matchup in the laning phase. The difference between Osiris pressure and Certa pressure though is that Osiris doesn't have great wave clear outside of those cleave basics. His 2 is okay, but usually requires grouping up the minion wave by aggroing it to hit all 6, and is really just a generic medium damage wave clear ability. His sickle hits 1 target and is only for poking the enemy god pretty much, while his 3 does no damage. Certa on the other hand has 2 abilities that are both great for wave clear. The main offender is of course Ember Walk, which has a whopping 470 base damage if all ticks hit, which isn't too hard on the minion wave, while also aggroing the wave by default, since if the enemy solo laner steps within 50 astronomical units of your wave to try and clear it, they will get tagged by Ember Walk, aggroing their minion wave to you and enabling the aforementioned cleave basics for crazy wave clear, while he doesn't care about taking minion damage because of the passive. So not only does he have arguably best in class wave clear, yes, even beating Bellona I would argue, he also aggroes the wave, meaning his own minions are harder to kill because your wave isn't targeting them dealing damage. Oh, and if for some ungodly reason Ember Walk plus 2 cleave basic attacks weren't enough for wave clear, he can also yeet one of his children at your minions for a more bursty clear option. To be honest, this is completely unnecessary and is body blockable, so in reality, this isn't used for wave clear much outside of maybe the first few levels, as supplementary damage to your main wave clear in Ember Walk plus cleave. But that does leave this pretty high damage stun available to throw poke at your opponent and stun them into your own wave, which is almost certainly still alive by the time you finish off theirs, and you can cause them to take excess minion damage from this. Speaking of that too, it does deceptively high damage when the child is being thrown, since it does the base damage plus the AoE damage for a total of 460 plus 100% scaling. Far above most warrior abilities, especially considering it stuns for 1.2 seconds. This thing hurts, especially when the imp hits you for a few stray hits afterwards while you're stunned, which can add a little bit of extra damage on. This nasty combination of great sustain through his passive, insane wave clear through his cleaves and Ember Walk, and great poking through imp toss and general chip damage from Ember Walk and his 1 plus your own minions, leads to a scenario where it's near impossible to compete against Surtr in the laning phase no matter who you pick. Most gods with high wave clear either don't have great sustain or don't have great poke. Osiris has no sustain but does have good clear and poke. Bellona has great clear and decent sustain but pretty bad poke. Chak's poke is pretty lackluster since his axe is easy to dodge at max range, but he has good clear and sustain. Surtr has best in class wave clear, great poke, and amazing sustain all in one package, and it makes for a near unbeatable laning phase that is either frustrating or boring to play against, depending on if you actually try and fight him early on, which I wouldn't recommend if you don't want to die 5 times before the laning phase is done. The one advantage you have over Surtr is that his ult is pretty useless for aggression in the lane. It's too slow to realistically reach anyone before they can make it to tower unless you're literally pressuring Surtr on his tower line, which is extremely rare for the reasons we just discussed. What this leads to is Surtr permanently having his ult up in the laning phase, making him damn near impossible to actually gank and kill. This leads to even more snowball from his absurd presence since any attempt to shut him down is just deleted by him pressing 4 and last spamming his way back to tower. This not only makes him very gank resistant, but has the added effect of most junglers who have tried to gank him once don't even bother trying anymore because they know it's a 1% chance of a kill and 99% chance of them wasting valuable time, while Surtr goes up into the battle bus and drops back to his own tower. Now, I've spent this whole rant on his laning phase because that's the main reason he's so oppressive in his current state, in my opinion. His late game and teamfighting is just kind of fine. His 1 can hit hard but isn't absurd in most games where you might have about 50 to 60 stacks by late game, and while the cooldown is very low, he does have to make sure he's playing well to stack this up, and it only hits slightly harder than your average warrior ability by late game if you're paying attention to the stat count. While his ult, like we just mentioned, is pretty slow and very easy to jump, dash, or teleport away from as the backliner, but that's part of the skill of diving as Surtr. You usually don't ult in unless you can try and catch someone by surprise or specifically against someone with no movement option. You usually blink in or flank, force someone's movement, then ult after them after that, at which point it's much harder to dodge, but overall, the ult is very average in late game teamfights in general. The only reason Certa can seem super strong in teamfights is because he's often rotating ahead of his solo laner with a 2 to 3 level lead because of his insane pressure and shutdown resistance through his ult. Any god looks strong when they're 2 to 3 levels and an entire item up on you, but the reason Surtr almost always has a lead from solo is because of his insane early game laning phase, which is basically impossible to compete with, and you spend a lot of it losing gold to tower, never getting any totems or silver buffs, and potentially even getting your blue invaded, since the aforementioned get out of jail free card ultimate can take Surtr back to his tower from enemy blue if he gets caught out. Same goes for proxying the wave, though that is of course a little bit more unsafe, but still more than doable. All these factors lead to Surtr leaving lane with a massive lead almost every game, and that's the main problem with the god. But what are your thoughts on Surtr? Let me know down below. Do you think he's super oppressive, or do you think he just needs a bit of nerfs to his laning phase for the most part? It'll be interesting to see what you guys think on this god, because I know he's been a relatively controversial release, and I will catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.